The title of the talk is Managing Strawberry Root Rot. Strawberries are a really interesting crop in Michigan. We used to have a lot of strawberry production in Michigan. One article said about 6,000 acres. Now it's probably more like 500 to 1,000. But it's a crop that does grow well here. One of the major issues is these perennial planting. If you're north of the Mason-Dixon line and you're east of the Rockies, you're probably growing strawberries on what's called a perennial matted row system, meaning that you plant the plants and then you're going to keep the bed active for 3 to 5 years. And that's the reason black root rot's an issue. It's this problem where the bed starts to go down after year two, but sometimes beds can last for 5 to 8 years. So really, the disease complex is a buildup of inoculum over time. If you were growing like they did in California or in the South, like in Florida, that's usually an annual production system. Usually you're planting in the late fall or in the early spring, and they're going to fruit every week, and you pick them all the time. And then in November, you'll rip the whole bed up and start it again. It works well in warmer climates. I would not expect black root rot to be a real issue in those because you're getting rid of the bed quite often. You still can have soil-borne problems. One thing about California is they struggle with verticillium and a couple other soil-borne pathogens that can recur in the bed, which is why fumigation is super important in that system. But it's not quite the same members that cause black root rot. So if you're reading stuff from Florida or California, take some of it with a grain of salt. So, and if you're a strawberry grower, you know all this, but it's nice to talk about why we have black root rot problems. It's because we have these beds that last for several years. We have had some good success in managing it. So we deal with a lot of diseases in strawberries. It's not just black root rot. Probably the most important would be gray mold of botrytis. That's the universal disease of strawberries. Buy them from the store, you'll find botrytis on your fruit sometimes, especially if it's older, and then it can infect the whole clamshell. But that's probably the most important disease and really what growers spend the most money managing. In our lab, we have some plots that have relatively high disease pressure, and we might spray 3 to 5 times for botrytis from green up all the way until that early part of June, just to help control it. Anthracnose crown rot, not a lot of fruit rot going on, but there is a crown rot issue, and a lot of that is coming from nursery problems. You don't see it too much in perennial systems, but if you did buy a bunch of new crowns, they could potentially have anthracnose. There's been some issues out west where there was an infection in the nursery and then people bought them and then there was big field deaths and they had to be replanted. Leaf spot, it's easy to see, but it's not really a huge issue. And then there's other diseases too. One I didn't have on here is a Neopestalotiopsis. There's a few nurseries that have had some issues with it in the eastern part of the US, and it's kind of gotten into the system essentially. It is a disease that can kill strawberry plants, so it's probably really important if you're going to buy strawberry crowns from the nursery from the east to ask about Neopestalotiopsis, if what they've done for it, how they're managing it, because we don't really have great management tools for it at the moment. It's an issue in both annual production type strawberries or in perennial matted rows. And it's really coming out of a nursery issue. So these are just some things to think about. The best thing to do to really manage any kind of soil-borne strawberry disease is crop rotations. If I found an old bulletin from 1915 and they were recommending an 8-year crop rotation. I found another one that said plant strawberries for 3 years and then wait 20 years before you come back to that same location. So that really was the main way that we used to control soil-borne diseases. There are other things to reduce like winter injury, covering things with straw. And this process of renovation that we typically do for June-bearing strawberries is really important because it gets rid of inoculum, really good for the foliar diseases, but it also helps aerate the canopy a little bit more. You get more airflow, and that probably also helps. There are some resistant varieties that you can take advantage of. But at the end of the day, we are really using fungicides. So this is gray mold. This is common leaf spot. If you ever grow strawberries in a greenhouse, powdery mildew can be a problem. Anthracnose crown rot fungicides can help here. And then the other one would be Phomopsis leaf blight. So usually Frax 7 and 11 would be really good on most of these things. There is some resistance in botrytis to this chemical class, so that I'll talk about that in a minute. But those tended to be the strongest products that we had for fungicides. Angular leaf spots caused by a bacteria kind of looks a little like common leaf spot, so fungicides aren't going to do anything to this disease. So if you're not sure, I've got a plug for the diagnostic clinic in the back of this presentation. If you see leaf spots and you're not really quite sure how to diagnose them, before you apply a chemical, it might be worth confirming what it is, because if it's angular leaf spot, fungicides aren't going to do anything. These two are caused by Phytophthora, so fungicides will work, but they're not the conventional fungicides. These are ones that are Oomycete products. So probably the most classic one would be like something like Ridamil, which I have some thoughts on at the end here. But red steel or leather rot, something like a Ridamil product would be quite strong on. So again, botrytis usually drives the program for managing diseases because botrytis is an issue of fruit quality. It causes the shelf life to go bad quickly. There is a blossom blight that occurs with strawberries too. So if you lose the blossoms, then you won't get the fruit. So it tends to be that people are most concerned about botrytis when they think about diseases in strawberries. And I just bring it up before we talk about black root rot, just because this is the big disease in the room, usually, at least on an individual season basis. Anyway, there's many different FRAC classes. So if you're not familiar, Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, that's what FRAC stands for. It's basically grouping chemicals by their modes of action, how they work, what they target. And this is looking at some of those different FRAC classes in this graph right here. We did a survey in 2014 and in 2019 and looked at how much resistance we tended to have in botrytis on fruit. So we went around, grabbed fruit, and then tested it for resistance. And we have quite a bit in Michigan. Upwards of 70% of isolates are resistant to phthanic methyl or FRAC1, boscolids FRAC7, pyrocostrobins FRAC11. To me, this means that growers tend to use pristine a lot because it's a good chemical to work on botrytis, but these two actives are the main ingredients of pristine. Cyprodinil was relatively high, and that's an active in switch, but we also saw some resistance to Elevate, which is FRAC17, and so forth. So it's not something that you can act on because these are the most important chemicals for managing botrytis. There's not another option to say don't use these. Really what it means to me is that we just have to be careful using them and rotate as much as we can. And then the best chemical that we have for botrytis control is probably switch. And that's because we find very little resistance. Even though there's some to cyprodinil, switch is cyprodinil, which is this one, and fludioxonil, which is this one over here, which is FRAC12. So the best chemical we have really is switch, probably also Mirabis prime, because both of those have fludioxonil in it, and we don't find much resistance to that chemical. So if you need it during bloom or a critical time to control botrytis, it's cool and wet, that's the one to rely on. But the other ones still have utility, and there might be reasons to pick certain ones. Okay, that's not what the talk was about, but I feel like that's an important thing to think about because really botrytis is what's driving a lot of the management programs for diseases. So on a black root, sometimes people they downplay them as an important issue just because they're kind of root nibbler pathogens. They make the root system slowly get worse over time. You'll end up with crowns that have black roots and very few feeder roots attached to them, and you'll pull up a crown and it'll be all black, and you just won't see a lot of nice feeder roots coming out of that crown. And that's not even that bad of a crown right there. It's caused by a bunch of different pathogens, and that's what makes this disease a little hard. People have identified Rhizoctonia, Pythium, and lesion nematodes as being the main ones, but there's other fungi like Cylindrocarpon and a couple others that are important in the complex. It's often a complex with other diseases like verticillium wilt and charcoal rot too. If there's flooding, you can also have red steel being implicated, which is a Phytophthora. It's kind of a mess of different things. There was a survey that was done in 2007 and 2008, looking at Ottawa County mostly, but a couple other fields as well. There's 560 feeder roots got sampled, and this is kind of what got pulled out. So there's quite a bit of Rhizoctonia, 20%. It's about 10% Cylindrocarpon, a lot of other, which mostly were considered beneficials, Trichoderma, Pythium, and Fusarium. But by and large, that was a lot of Rhizoctonia, and people have been able to show and demonstrate that Rhizoctonia, Cylindrocarpon, and Pythium can cause black root rot in laboratory studies. This is a rating scale. What you want to see is a really healthy crown versus a sad crown where there's a lot of less growth. But you can see that number 5's got a lot of fine feeder roots at the bottom here, and so does 4. But there's less and less of those as you go down my rating scale. So we made this rating scale to look at root health in this study. The study I'm going to show you is mostly done in 2007 and 2008. And then I've got a recent study that I'm going to show you. too. So the main way to control black root rot is to think about what you can do at different times. If you can avoid planting in a flooded soil or a soil that doesn't drain very well, that's good. Having organic matter can improve texture for heavy soils. That's also good. And then having a cover crop in a spot for a couple years or a year at least is also good. So ryegrasses, any kind of grass, something that's not a dicot, just to have other things that will grow there. So you'll have different microbes in the soil. And it's on the label to do pre-plant dips with fungicides. So this is during planting. I would say that dipping with Abound is probably your best bet for crowns. It could also have some effect if you had crown rot or other things coming from a nursery. A pre-plant dip might be something to consider. If you can use tolerant varieties, that's also good. Post-planting, there's not a lot you can do. Fertilizing the bed is really helpful, keeping it really vigorous and growing, because a lot of this is a slow decline in the bed. So anything to push the bed to keep growing as much as it can is probably going to help against black root rot. And drenches with a fungicide. So this study is about how Abound works as a drench. So this was done in 2007 and 2008. And these are different treatments with azoxystrobin, so that's Abound, and Abound plus Profit or Fostrol at the time, but it could be any phosphite. Phosphites are known to be sort of systemic, and Abound is used actually quite a bit in potatoes as a drench. And so this is available on the label if you look. I've got a slide on that later. How to do it is a little tricky, but it is available on the label. So if you read the label carefully for Abound, it'll give you some ideas. Anyway, we looked at it in 2007, assessed plants, and then we looked at it in 2008. So we applied a lot of water in this case to try to get the chemical down. You probably don't have to do this excessive amount, but our goal was to try to get the chemical down to the root zone. So we applied about 1,000 gallons an acre. I think you can do 200. If you had a trench alongside the root area, and then we're adding the chemical into that trench, that's also a possibility. How to do it's not explicitly put on the label, but it is labeled for the crop. It's just how you actually apply the drench is a little bit different, but I'll show you some of the data. So in 2007, we didn't have any difference between the treatments, but then we saw a big difference in 2008, where azoxystrobin had the highest yield, but it was the same as azoxystrobin with the phosphites. So this is where we come at the idea of azoxystrobin as a drench is probably effective. And these were applied 5 times. So it's 3 times in 2007 and then 2 times in 2008. So it's a fair number of applications, but sometimes there's a big cost of moving the strawberry bed. So it might still be a cost-effective way to do it. This is the root health rating. So the roots looked pretty rough in 2007 when we rated them. This is in August. And the more black the bar is, the less healthy those roots looked. So we harvested from the untreated and the ones that we treated. But in 2008, a lot of the different treatments looked relatively healthy root-wise, but the untreated did not. So that's kind of encouraging. That probably means some of the nutrients helped too in terms of root health. We just didn't see a corresponding yield bump in some of those. We just saw that with the fungicide mostly. So we concluded from that Abound drenches seem to be effective at limiting black root rot. And at this site, primarily we had Rhizoctonia and Pythium, and we only found lesion nematodes once in a while. So some growers throughout Michigan are using these techniques. I bet if you reach out to everybody's network and find people growing strawberries, some are applying drench fungicides for Abound to continue the life of their bed. And if you want to look, there's this whole section of how to do it on the strawberry label. Okay, so I wanted to talk about some other products and things we've done recently. So we looked at a couple other products recently, Convoy, Vellum, and Ridamil Gold. Ridamil Gold is pretty targeted towards Phytophthora and Pythium. Vellum's meant for fungi mostly, but also nematodes. This is the same active ingredient that's in the Luna products, but they've actually marketed this more for nematodes. Convoy is something totally different. It's a Fernex 7. So we did a trial, same idea in 2023 and 2024, where we applied stuff a bunch of times just to see if we'd get an effect on root health. So we applied Convoy, which is this flutionil. We were working with a biological at the time, Ridamil, Abound, Vellum Prime, and then Vellum Prime plus Ridamil. And we applied it 6 times, which I realize is an expensive treatment, but we had a site that was pretty infested. And our goal was really just to see if these treatments would work at all. So we had a fair bit of black root rot in the field. We had a lot of beds that weren't quite full. This was a 3 or 4-year-old strawberry field. So this is a photo from 2024 after we'd done all the treatments. This is what the Abound treatment looked like. So that was good to see because that's what we were saying worked back in 2008. The Ridamil and Ridamil plus Vellum worked quite well. It's kind of great when all the treatments work, but that's what happened here. So these are just some photos of what the stand looked like. We rate something in our lab called bed fill. Basically, the bed grows out a little bit because it's runnering and getting a little wider. And this is width and this is height. So this is how much bed fill we had. So basically, the plants were growing quite vigorously. Almost all the treatments had more growth, and the best treatment was Vellum Prime and Ridamil. That was our strongest, but that was pretty close to Abound too. Statistically, not really able to separate those, but the untreated was quite poor. We had the best fruit weight with Vellum and Ridamil, and that's by far the most expensive thing to do because that's two relatively expensive products being applied together 6 times. So again, we were just trying to show that this would work, but there was a lot more pounds of fruit that we pulled off of this particular plot. So that's nice to see. We also dug some plants and saw if they had black root rot symptoms. All of our plants in the untreated had black root rot symptoms, 100% of the ones we dug, and we had very little of that in the Vellum plus Ridamil. So anyway, it seems like the Abound treatment still works in 2023 and 2024, which is nice. Vellum and Ridamil also are likely alternatives, might actually be better than Abound. The Convoy was interesting. It's something we didn't expect to work. It's something that could be good for botrytis control too, because it's a Frax7. And it looks like there may be some biofungicides that might also have some capability here too, but that's something we need to keep working on. So kind of concluding my thoughts here, I just want to say that probably the most important thing for managing this disease, it's a disease complex. It's to get a relationship with a diagnostic lab. It's relatively cheap to do diagnoses on things at Michigan State University. If you don't know, this is the website, and there's a button you click here that's how to submit a sample. You can bring the sample yourself to Michigan State. This is the address. There's a form to fill out, but I think that's probably the first thing I would do if I saw a declining bed, because you don't really know what's causing the decline unless you've had testing done. So once you do the diagnoses, if you have fungi with Rhizoctonia and Cylindrocarpon, these two chemicals should work relatively well. So Vellum and Abound. If you have oomycetes, Ridamil should work relatively well. And then if you have nematodes, Vellum is what you want to go with. Vellum and Ridamil makes sense if you've got all of them in the mix, but if you don't have all the players, you might be able to go to a cheaper product like Abound if you just had fungi there. And that's it. So thank you everybody for your time.